Yeah, that's right.
Yeah. All right, I think we can start now. If it's all right with everyone, I'm just going to restart and people can kind of trickle in from here. The first part is mostly, again, just biography. All right, so who is James Burnham and why did he leave the left? And what is sort of the context in which James Burnham's thought comes to be? And James Burnham, as the figure we know him as today, comes to be. And that context is really the failed continuation of Second International leftism in the American Trotskyist movement, and the solidification of imperialism as a permanent crisis. So Burnham was a Trotskyist, and he was involved personally with Trotsky himself. He actually exchanged letters with Leon Trotsky after Leon Trotsky had been expelled from the Soviet Union. And he is a very major figure in the American Trotskyist movement and canon in the 1930s, alongside Max Shachtman and James Cannon. And part of the reason for that is he wrote several very influential pamphlets, including one on the Popular Front, that is actually still so widely read today that it, in fact, the Spartacist League links to it on their website, on their, I don't know if they call them FAQs, but it's something roughly analogous to that. Maybe they're called their line or something. He sort of, though, broke with Trotsky alongside Max Shachtman over this question of the Soviet Union and what does it mean to defend the Soviet Union as a degenerated worker state, whether it actually qualifies as such, whether the Soviet system was socialism or whether it was something sort of else. So this is really sort of where this conflict between him and Max Shachtman and Cannon comes to be, but he actually breaks further. He breaks further from Max Shachtman, whereas Shachtman sort of argues that the Soviet Union has become bureaucratic collectivism, which he argues is, a sort of an even worse form of social domination as capitalism, at least to some extent, than what is practiced at least in the United States. Burnham actually argues that the Soviet Union, Nazi Germany, and the United States in the New Deal era are actually undergoing the same process. And that process is that a new class is developing and a new system is developing. And that class is the managerial class, and their rule is being implemented, and the new system is managerialism. He publishes this all about no more than 5 years after writing several very influential Trotskyist pamphlets. He publishes this in 1941. And so it's very important to note that he also is publishing this at the very beginning of World War II. So what does this actually all sort of mean? Burnham and imperialism are sort of a theoretical relationship that I'd like to sort of touch on, as well as a contextual one. Where does Burnham follow the logic of Lenin's imperialism pamphlet? And where does he break from it? And how does this sort of represent Burnham's failure to think dialectically? And where does it represent his sort of successes in being sort of a observer of the moment, if you will, and an observer of social reality? So Lenin proposes, of course, that imperialism is the result of monopolization and cartelization of industry and the increasing reach of finance. And this is imperialism as the highest stage of capitalism. It's separate from what Marx is talking about it as imperialism. Burnham actually agrees with Lenin's definition more or less, but he doesn't call it imperialism. He breaks really over the question of whether or not the class of people, which he calls managers, which are technically educated people, maybe they're technically educated in how to control workers, or they're simply technically educated in something like engineering, who really manage these monopolistic firms. And so he really breaks as to whether this is actually the highest phase of capitalism or a new development from it. And if it isn't the highest phase of capitalism, then that sort of explains how Burnham is able to make sort of the claim that the United States in the New Deal, the USSR, and Nazi Germany are actually all undergoing a sort of convergent process. And so this is really where he goes from dialectic to flattened form of observation. So he states certain individuals, the operating executives, production managers, plant superintendents, and their associates have charge of the actual technical process of producing. It is their job to organize the materials, tools, machines, plant facilities, equipment, and labor in such a way as to turn out the automobiles. These are the individuals whom I call the managers. So that's who he's describing as the managers. And then he further states that the managerial class, in his opinion, has captured the state in its own interests. And these interests lead to an increasingly large and unlimited state. Hence the relation to both Stalinism and fascism, and for that matter, the New Deal, which one could argue is also fascist. And it is. In capitalist society, the role of government in the economy is always secondary. The government acts in the economy chiefly to preserve the integrity of the market and of capitalist property relations, and to give aid and comfort, as in wars or international competition, or internal disturbances where these are needed. This we have noted in describing the general features of capitalist society, this restriction in the government's sphere of activity, whatever the form of government, dictatorial or democratic, in the political sphere, is not a coincidence, but it must be stressed again, an integral part of the whole social structure of capitalism. Capitalist economy is a system of private ownership of a certain type vested in private individuals, a private enterprise. The capitalist state is therefore necessarily a limited state. So he's sort of making right there a sort of separation between the two. Whereas, the sort of the Nazi state, the Soviet state, and the US state under the New Deal are increasingly becoming these sort of unlimited leviathans. The capitalist state perhaps was significantly less interventionist in society. And so to go back to Lenin, Lenin also agrees that such a state is actually quite burdenful on the average person, but he would disagree with Burnham on the idea that the technical knowledge contained by the managers is somehow this sort of neo-aristocracy or this perversion of sort of the third estate as becoming the nation or something. So Lenin considered the prospect of imperialism continuing, which is really what it is that Burnham's describing, to be worse than the prospect of capitalism in some sort of the old sense continuing, although he would say that, of course, capitalism continuing would lead to imperialism. But I'll quote here again from Lenin: competition becomes transformed into monopoly. The result is immense progress in the socialization of production. In particular, the process of technical invention and improvement becomes socialized. This is something quite different from the old free competition between manufacturers, scattered and out of touch with one another and producing for an unknown market. Concentration has reached the point at which it is possible to make an approximate estimate of all the sources of all raw materials, for example, the iron ore deposits of a country, and even, as we shall see, of several countries or of the whole world. Not only are such estimates made, but these sources are captured by gigantic monopolist associations. An approximate estimate of the capacity of markets is also made, and the associations divide them up amongst themselves by agreement. Skilled labor is monopolized and the best engineers are engaged. The means of transfer are captured: railways in America, shipping companies in Europe and America. Capitalism in its imperialist stage leads directly to the most comprehensive socialization of production. It, so to speak, drags the capitalists against their will and consciousness into some sort of new social order, a transitional one from complete free competition to complete socialization. And so this is what's really important comes next. Production becomes social, but appropriation remains private. The social means of production remains the private property of a few. The general framework of formally recognized free competition remains, and the yoke of a few monopolists on the rest of the population becomes 100 times heavier, more burdensome and intolerable. So Lenin is recognizing that imperialism has sort of an antinomy of being, on the one hand, capable of leading to a direct socialization of production and thus a more free society if it is carried to that by the conscious movement of the working class. And on the flip side of that, something that's far more intolerable and far more burdensome, and that will inevitably sort of drag the state along with it in that direction. But by the time Burnham is writing, there's really no left outside of Stalinism. The Trotskyist movement is really not worked. It's pretty much failed in its mission. It never really got off the ground. It had a few thousand sort of members at most in the United States. It never sort of left any lasting political imprint. And a managerial government has really taken over the three main powers in the world as World War II comes to a head: the USSR, Nazi Germany, and the USA. With the USSR and Nazi Germany really expressing the most severe forms of this, whereas the USA is sort of getting its start with the New Deal. So Burnham writes, the traditional and necessary capitalist role of government is, as everyone knows, now being quickly abandoned in all nations, has altogether been abandoned in at least one, and close to abandoned in several others. Government is moving always more widely into the economy. No matter who runs the government or for what, every new incursion of government into the economy means that one more section of the economy is wholly or partially removed from the reign of capitalist economic relations. And so it's important to note that actually Horkheimer and Pollock make similar points in The Authoritarian State, which is written roughly around the same time Burnham is writing, in the 1940s. And so Horkheimer writes, the bourgeoisie has been decimated, and the majority of members have lost their independence. Where they have not been thrown into the ranks of the proletariat, or more commonly into the masses of unemployed, they have become dependents of the big concerns of the state. When the ruling class must feed the workers instead of being fed by them, revolution is at hand. This theory of the end grows out of a situation which was still ambiguous and is itself ambiguous. Either it counts on collapse through an economic crisis, thereby ruling out the stabilization of an authoritarian state, as Engels in fact predicted, or else the theory expects the triumph of the authoritarian state, thus foreclosing collapse through a crisis, which was always defined by the market economy. But state capitalism does away with the market and hypostasizes the crisis for the duration of the internal Germany. Its economic inevitability signifies a step forward, a breathing spell for the rulers. Unemployment becomes organized. Only the already well-established section of the bourgeoisie is still really interested in the market. Big industrialists today denounce liberalism only when state administration remains too liberal for them, not completely under their control. The modern planned economy can feed the masses better and be better fed by them than by the vestiges of the market. So we see here, they're actually working through sort of the same history here and sort of the same phenomena. And so this gets back even further to Bonapartism, which might actually sort of be the beginning of this sort of crisis of the state, as well as this crisis of bureaucracy in society, even if not the same crisis that they're discussing, because we're not quite at that point of Lenin's imperialism. We're still living in a free market to some extent when Marx is writing the 18th Brumaire. We're also, when Marx is writing the 18th Brumaire, the bourgeoisie can still rule. They still have that capability, but things are beginning to sort of expose themselves as perhaps becoming untenable. Mass proletarianization is not quite there yet, but there are certainly developing discontents by that point. So Bonapartism is really the beginning of sort of a triad. because it reintegrates bourgeois discontents into a bureaucracy to reproduce capitalism. And so that triad would be sort of, you have Bonapartism, you have imperialism, and then imperialism, if continued, becomes what Horkheimer and Burnham are describing here as managerialism. It's just one side of the coin, so to speak. And so, it reintegrates bourgeois discontents into the bureaucracy to reproduce capitalism. And so, as Marx writes in the 18th Brumaire, the executive power, with its enormous bureaucratic and military organization, with its wide-ranging and ingenious state machinery, with a host of officials numbering 500,000, besides an army of another 500,000, this terrifying parasitic body which enmeshes the body of French society and chokes all its pores, sprang up in the time of the absolute monarchy, with the decay of the feudal system, which it had helped to hasten. The seignorial privileges of the landowners and towns became transformed into many attributes of the state power, the feudal dignitaries into paid officials, and the motley patterns of conflicting medieval plenary powers into a regulated plan of state authority whose work is divided and centralized as in a factory. And so there's, the state here is replicating the factory bureaucracy, and moreover, that state is the state that inevitably clears the way for imperialist aggression and the increasing organization of the economy by the state. And likewise, managerialism in some ways replicates this dynamic of these sort of discontents among the quote unquote elite being integrated back into the society. And this is the same thing Horkheimer talks about, and Burnham also talks about it as well, where, in their case, you have sort of the old bourgeois goes out and simply becomes dependent on this sort of managerial society and becomes part of the managerial class. And so what I really want to get to, though, today, and this is just the most important thing, is where is the left in all of this? And what does this all mean to the left? The stakes of the question of Burnham are not whether he is descriptively right. That is pretty much settled. The question is where and how he fails to think dialectically, to understand the managerial society as both a necessary stabilization of capitalism and imperialism in the stage of imperialism, as well as its barbaric twinned reality all at once. Some would say that today we're sort of in this post-Fordist economy. You hear all about the market, and they would say neoliberalism is the end of this system. But neoliberalism actually merely replicates managerialism with less state control of the managers. So you can actually have the managerial firm be less controlled by sort of the nation state, as it were. And you can have it sort of be a more globalized community. The fact that the vast majority of citizens do not own small businesses in some sort of federalist, libertarian, neo-Jeffersonian society proves that societal reproduction is under the control of the administrative regime, regardless of whether people think that somehow we've gone back to liberalism. The state still intervenes, and the free market is used pretty much as ideological justification for the reign of the manager-run trusts and state over humanity and neoliberalism. The left reinforces Burnhamism as a way of thinking and the conditions of managerialism. Both cultural and economic demands of the current left, or at least much of it, demonstrate this. So for instance, you can look at the Sanders movement. Really just based its demands on a greater circulation of managerial elites through various schemes to increase college participation, so free college for all, more healthcare workers, more sensitivity training, whatever. And this is actually really Burnhamism par excellence, because this is really what Burnham's solution is, which Ed will get to in a little bit with the Machiavellians. But really throughout all of this, what are we seeing here? We're seeing lowering of the horizons. We're seeing, instead of the left say, well, we have these firms, the real question on the table needs to be, what would it mean to use what is to create what ought to be, which is a social, free society, right? A society not dominated by managers, but a society that can still have all the benefits of having managers, for instance. And so the left's positions on cultural issues reinforce the managerial regime. And thus imperialism and thus Bonapartism and capitalism's own reproduction. And we have to look too at how the left's alliance with the Democratic Party is really key here, because the Democratic Party is just one of the two parties that manages the system of imperialist capitalism. By the left becoming part of it or integrated with it, or sort of its sycophants, the left in many ways comes to just reinforce and reproduce managerialism as a system. And it reproduces Burnhamism as a mode of thinking by lowering horizons to just how can we have better managers, or how can we better circulate managers, or something like this. And so the current left really identifying itself with the Democratic Party doesn't substantially disentangle itself from the imperialist system. And as a result, it comes into service of the negative side of the imperialism, managerialism antinomy. That is to say, it comes into the side of managerialism. So the new left, emphasizing cultural issues, actually clears the way for managerial forms of sexual liberation, racial integration, and so on, with these things actually becoming sort of new modes of domination, not actually free or liberated forms of life. And this also has the other result of sort of working class and petit bourgeois resentments against sort of this top-down mode of changing society becoming so strong among the left. Managers are, of course, necessary in a complex world, but any attempt to strengthen or reinforce managers as the ruling class of the state and of the economy is necessarily conservative. And so the goal here, the lesson really for Burnham, for today's left specifically, is the need to understand the dead left, which is them, as part and parcel of the imperialist political economy that is better identified as with regression as it serves the managerial state, which is the continuation of imperialism. Likewise, it is to understand how they reproduce Burnhamism in wanting different managers doing different things. Burnhamism today can have different forms. It can have a left form which seeks a cosmopolitan, multicultural, feminist managerialism. You can have sort of this centrist Burnhamism or whatever, which sort of seeks to mitigate and throw support behind the quote unquote most free managerial societies, which is sort of the Burnhamism of Burnham to an extent. And then you can have like right-wing Burnhamism, which seeks to either somehow go backwards or to orient Burnhamism towards specifically reactionary ends. So, religion, nationalism, race, etc. But ultimately, these express themselves all in the bourgeois politics of today. And the left's capitulation to neoliberalism being, in fact, a capitulation of the reproduction of managerialism in a form that is progressive, according to them, while Trumpism represented the practical tendency to see the strengthening of the nation economically as the necessary task for managerialism today, and warring with those sections of the managerial class not in favor of this vision. So you actually have sections of the managerial class, and they're both actually throwing their support and weight behind different aspects of managerialism, but neither are actually proposing any sort of serious challenge to the system. A real left would seek to overcome managerialism while recognizing the necessity of managers. Just as opposing managerialism is insufficient and conservative, we can't go back to the sort of Jefferson yeoman farmer world. tomorrow. It's just not possible. And just as mere opposition to imperialism is insufficient and conservative, a socialist, we have to somehow find a way to advocate for beyond these things, right? And so a socialist party can and would, of course, be a place for petit bourgeois conservatives who are resentful of the managerial class and just want to be left alone. But it would also be a place for managerial class people seeking to escape their own role in societal domination, as well as just the way in which society is run today. So the real goal here would be to have something, a system with managers that's not managerialism, a system with empire that's not imperialism, a system that perhaps overcomes Bonapartism instead of simply continues it in a different form every time. And so I'm just going to leave here with a sort of warning from Horkheimer's authoritarian state. And if anything can be said about the danger of Burnham's thought, as well as the society he describes to the young leftist, it is this: whatever seeks to extend itself under domination runs the danger of reproducing it. This is really key. And this warning from Horkheimer should remind us that the progressive state will not really save anybody. Corporations calling themselves woke or whatever is not going to save the world. And that in the absence of a serious mass party on the left, whatever calls itself left will simply be part and parcel of the system of control, as the left's continued support for Democrats today demonstrates for all to see. All right, that's my presentation.
Thank you, Wyatt. So I am going to present on Burnham's book, The Machiavellians, which was published a year or two after the Managerial Revolution. And I think that the Machiavellians actually represents sort of the key pivot point in Burnham's thought, where he's sort of taking cognizance of everything that he laid out in the Managerial Revolution and turning it towards the politics that he would prosecute for the remainder of his life. Now, just for reference, I'm going to share with you all in the chat where you can find the book itself, if you're wondering about the text that I'm about to speak on. So my presentation is divided into 3 parts. In the first part, I really just want to lay out Burnham's political sociology. What is he saying in the Machiavellians, Defenders of Freedom? Who are the Machiavellians? What does he mean by Machiavellianism? And what does he mean when he calls them Defenders of Freedom? In the second part of my presentation, I want to focus on a particular passage. I'm going to read a lot. I'm going to try to paste it into the chat so you can read along with me, in which Burnham critiques the Democratic Party of his day as Bonapartist. And I want to try to lay out what he means by that. And in the final section, I want to consider Burnham from the perspective of the revolutionary Marxism of the Second International. And I imagine that much of that will come out in our discussion. So I'm not going to lay too much emphasis on that point. But I do want to close on that point because I think it's an important one. So first of all, the summary of Burnham's political sociology in the Machiavellians. What does it mean to describe something as Machiavellian? For Burnham, the essence of Machiavellianism is to know the truth about political power, to dispense with all wishful or fantastic thinking about those who rule politically and those who are ruled politically, to view the elite and the non-elite through the lens of an anti-utopian, an explicitly anti-utopian, ostensibly social scientific realism. Burnham's ultimate aim, as I'll show, is to advise the rulers of the newly managerially revolutionized society. But Burnham argues in part 1 of the Machiavellians that the Machiavellian perspective furnishes the ruled as well with a basis on which to oppose the rulers. Burnham writes, The powerful and their spokesmen, all the official thinkers, the lawyers and philosophers and preachers and demagogues and moralists and editors, must defame Machiavelli. Machiavelli says that rulers lie and break faith. This proves, they say, the powerful say, that Machiavelli libels human nature. Machiavelli says that ambitious men struggle for power. Machiavelli is apologizing for the opposition, the enemy, the rulers say, and trying to confuse you about us who wish to lead you for your own good and welfare. Machiavelli says that you must keep strict watch over officials and subordinate them to the law. The rulers say he is encouraging subversion and the loss of national unity. Machiavelli says that no man with power is to be trusted. You see that his aim is to smash all your faith and ideals. So Burnham writes, small wonder that the powerful and public denounce Machiavelli. Burnham argues that the popular usage of the word Machiavellian as a term of abuse reflects something like a conspiracy of the rulers to tarnish the reputation of ideas, of Machiavelli's ideas, that would better enable the ruled to counteract and hold in check the power of the rulers. While the Machiavellians is replete with transhistorical social scientific claims, Burnham does ground both Machiavelli himself, as well as the assemblage of late 19th and early 20th century social scientists, whom he groups under the heading of the modern Machiavellians, in two distinct epochs of social revolution. Burnham follows the traditional Marxist reading of Machiavelli as an early philosopher of the bourgeois revolution. Then, consistent with his theory that capitalist society has given way during the 4 decades between 1900 and 1940 to a new managerial society, Burnham reads the social scientists Vilfredo Pareto, Gaetano Mosca, Robert Michels, and George Sorel as the key thinkers of the Managerial Revolution. He writes, the crisis of capitalist society was made plain by the First World War. With a far from accidental anticipation, much of the chief work of the modern Machiavellians was done in the period immediately preceding that war. Gaetano Mosca, it is true, had formulated many of his ideas as early as 1883. However, his mature and finished thought is presented with the war experiences close at hand in the revised and expanded 1923 edition of Elements of a Political Science, which is the basis of what has been translated into English as The Ruling Class. George Sorel's active career went on through the war and ended with his death in 1922. Robert Michels and Vilfredo Pareto were writing their major books when the First World War began. So why does Burnham consider these social scientists to be the key thinkers of his age? Recall, as I mentioned at the outset, that Burnham makes a theoretical distinction between a ruling socio-political elite on the one hand and a non-ruling socio-political non-elite on the other. This distinction serves for Burnham as a transhistorical theory of political sociology that is meant to encapsulate two phenomena central to what we in Platypus would call the death of the left. Firstly, the political victory of the reformist, anti-revolutionary, and revisionist Marxist trade union bureaucracy over the radical and revolutionary wing within the social democratic mass parties of the Second International, above all within the Social Democratic Party of Germany, the largest of these parties, during the years surrounding the First World War. And secondly, the political rise and consolidation of a Stalinist bureaucracy within a one-party state that embraced, by the 1930s, a strategy of nationalist modernization in the wake of the International Proletarian Revolution's defeat circa 1919. Our member Richard Rubin has described these two respective developments as the German problem and the Russian problem within the history of Marxism. For Burnham, both problems express a more fundamental problem, indeed a social scientific law. And it may not be an injustice to Burnham to summarize this law in just 2 words: power corrupts. Burnham thinks power corrupts according to particular and identifiable patterns. If every society is characterized by a ruling socio-political elite and a non-ruling socio-political non-elite, then democracy, what is democracy in that case? Democracy in Burnham's sense refers not to elections and parliaments, nor to the ideal of self-government, but rather to the extent to which a specific process known as, quote, the circulation of the elites, as defined by the sociologist Vilfredo Pareto, can be said to be in effect. The opposite of democracy in this more sociological sense is not autocracy, but aristocracy. So Burnham writes, summarizing his concept of, Pareto's concept of the circulation of the elites. The elite in any society is never static. Its structure, its composition, and the way in which it is related to the rest of the society are always changing. What influences social development is not the mere shift of individuals, but change in the types of individual and in the relation of various types to each other and to the rest of society. There are always obstacles, or ties, as Pareto calls them, that interfere with the free circulation of individuals up and down the social scale. The most evident and universal of the obstacles to free circulation is the aristocratic principle. The children of members of the elite are helped to a position in the elite regardless of their own capacities, and at the sacrifice of individuals of greater capacity appearing among the non-elite. If this principle is carried far enough, if the elite becomes closed, or almost so, degeneration is bound to set in. The percentage of weak and inferior persons within the elite necessarily increases, while at the same time superior persons accumulate among the non-elite. A point is reached where the elite will be overthrown and destroyed. From these considerations, it follows that a relatively free circulation of the elites, both up and down the social scale, is a requisite for a healthy and a strong society. Conversely, it follows that when in a society the elite becomes closed or nearly closed, that society is threatened either with internal revolution or with destruction from outside. Burnham's analysis suggests that the socio-political elites in Germany proved more capable of democratically integrating the upwardly mobile forces of organized social democracy than did their more aristocratic Russian counterparts, seeming to confirm the Italian syndicalist Robert Michel's theory of the, quote, iron law of oligarchy. Meanwhile, the Bolshevik party forces, which democratically displaced the latter, eventually reconstituted a new socio-political elite of their own in turn, seeming to confirm the expectations of the French syndicalist Georges Sorel. How then are the modern Machiavellians, in Burnham's view, defenders of freedom, to quote the subtitle of the book? Well, if Burnham's conception of the necessary and inevitable limits of political possibility is grounded in Pareto's theory of the circulation of the elites, supplemented by the ideas of Michels and Sorel, then Burnham's conception of the relative possibilities for political freedom is grounded in Gaetano Mosca's theory of juridical defense. Mosca cuts an unusual figure by the standards of contemporary politics in the sense that he could be described as simultaneously ultra-liberal and consciously anti-democratic. As an early 20th century Italian parliamentarian and political theorist, Mosca consistently championed political rights and liberties while assailing mass democratic movements, especially fascism, which threatened these rights. Burnham summarizes Mosca's conception of juridical defense as follows. Quote, juridical defense means government by law and due process, not merely formally in the words of constitutions or statutes, but in fact. It means a set of impersonal restrictions on those who hold power, and correlatively a set of protections for the individuals against the state and those who have power. The specific forms of juridical defense include the familiar democratic rights, quote unquote democratic rights. Again, now here, democracy is being used in the more political sense of political rights and liberties rather than in the prior sense of the circulation of elites. Quote, in countries that have so far rightly been reputed free, private property cannot be violated arbitrarily. A citizen cannot be arrested and condemned unless specified rules are observed. Each person can follow the religion of his choice without forfeiture of his civil and political rights. The press cannot be subjected to censorship and is free to discuss and criticize acts of government. Finally, if they conform within certain rules, citizens can meet to engage in discussions of political character, and they can form associations for the attainment of moral, political, or professional ends. That's quoting Mosca. Of all these rights, Burnham writes, Mosca considers the right of public discussion, of free speech, as we usually call it, the most important and the strongest foundation of juridical defense as a whole. So, in short, we could think of juridical defense here, this conception as, the First Amendment and other sort of Bill of Rights, political liberties in the United States. This perspective sets up the conservative liberalism which Burnham would prosecute for the remainder of his life. If socialist revolution is off the table, and social revolution within capitalism henceforth refers to nothing more than the circulation of the upper and middle managerial ranks of the ruling socio-political elite, then the task of freedom is redefined as nothing more and nothing less than the safeguarding of the specifically political rights and liberties which facilitate the ability of upwardly mobile aspirants to the elite and to the middle managerial classes to organize an open political opposition to the existing established elite. Only true liberalism can ensure the democratic circulation of elites, in this view, in other words. But liberalism must also guard against the tendency to trample over political rights and liberties in the interest of quickening the process of elite circulation and dissolving the established aristocracy in favor of the socio-political upstarts. It is this liberal vigilance in the face of democratic overreach which forms the basis of Burnham's critique of Bonapartism. So now in what follows, I want to read a longish section from the closing section of the Machiavellians to give you a sense of Burnham's critique of Bonapartism. When I first read this, I found it extremely sort of bracing, and I think it's worth considering and engaging. I'm going to see if I can. Oh, it looks like I may be prevented from pasting chat of text of this length in the chat. So I'm going to read it and then just have a few comments on it. So Burnham writes, if we ask what are the primary effects in our own time of the democratic formula of self-government and the suffrage machinery, we must reply that they are to strengthen the international trend towards Bonapartism. It can hardly be denied that this trend exists, that it is the most indisputable political tendency of our generation. In every advanced nation, we observe the evolution of the form of government toward that wherein a small group of leaders or a single leader claims to represent and speak for the whole people. As the embodiment of the will of the whole people, the leader claims an unlimited authority and considers all intermediary political bodies, such as parliaments or local governments, to be wholly dependent on the central sovereignty, which can alone stand legitimately for the people.
Ed,
yes.
Gabriel just asked if you could send the section you're reading to the list or Facebook.
Oh yeah. That's a good idea. Let me do that.
Yeah.
I'll share it on the list, and I think most of us here are members, so that should be just fine to do. Okay, so that's a direct quote. So I just shared it on the thread on the list. The regime is democratically legalized by the use of the suffrage mechanism in the form of plebiscites. These are the characteristics of Bonapartism. We find them completely developed in Germany and Russia, and more closely approximated in England and the United States. Bonapartism is a type of government very dissimilar to what men in the 19th century ordinarily thought of as democracy. Nevertheless, as we have already seen, Bonapartism does not violate the formula of democracy nor the place assigned to suffrage. Rather, can Bonapartist theory plausibly claim to be the logical as well as the historical culmination of the democratic formula, just as the plebiscite can claim to be the most perfect form of democratic suffrage. The Bonapartist leader can regard himself and be regarded as the quintessential democrat. His despotism is simply the omnipotent people ruling and disciplining itself. This is just what the Bonapartist leaders themselves and their spokesmen argue. When democracy is defined in terms of self-government, there can be no convincing democratic answer. Now here Burnham begins to sort of critique the left of his time, up to including the progressivism of the Democratic Party of the 1930s and 1940s. Burnham writes, when we translate formal meanings into real meanings, the people's century, the century of the common man, become like the people's state and the classless society, variant expressions, the real meaning of which is, quote, the century of political Bonapartism, or, quote, the Bonapartist state. Striking support for this conclusion is provided by the speeches and writings of Vice President Wallace, Henry Wallace, who is the major prophet in this country of the Bonapartist mystique. Wallace, it may be recalled, never held elective office prior to 1941. It is unanimously agreed that he is in his present position solely because of the personal demand of the president, which was counter to the prior wishes of almost all the delegates to the 1940 convention of the Democratic Party. Wallace's nomination by the convention and his share in Roosevelt's electoral victory was thus not a voluntary expression of the will of either the delegates or the people at large, but a plebiscitary confirmation of a decision made in fact by a leader. Wallace's most remarkable expression so far of his point of view was the speech which he delivered at Madison Square Garden in New York City on November 8, 1942. His mere presence at the meeting was sufficiently indicative. The meeting was organized by a committee created by the American representatives of the Communist International, which called itself the Congress of American Soviet Friendship. Its occasion was the celebration of the 25th anniversary of the Russian Revolution. And here Burnham writes, the press overlooked the detail that the revolution in question was not the revolution against Tsarism, which took place in March 1917, but the November Bolshevik Revolution against the parliamentary democratic government of Kerensky, the revolution which in its development has led to the most extreme totalitarian Bonapartist government in history. So we see here in Burnham a sort of a trace of the Lenin led to Stalin sort of theory of the Russian Revolution. Wallace opened his speech as follows: "We have been helping the Russians celebrate this afternoon a glorious birthday." Only the first 3 paragraphs of the speech contain any references to the present war. The rest is a comparative social commentary on Russia and the United States and a statement of social program. After quoting some century-old words of Tocqueville on Russia, Wallace discovers that, quote, Russia and the United States are far closer than Tocqueville could possibly have imagined. Both, he declares, are striving for the education, the productivity, and the enduring happiness of the common man. Wallace's goal, in common with Russia's, is, quote, the new democracy, the democracy of the common man. This new democracy, quote, includes not only the Bill of Rights, but also economic democracy, ethnic democracy, educational democracy, and democracy in the treatment of the sexes, all of which must, quote, be woven together into a harmonious whole. Of these 5 types, which make up the harmonious whole of the democracy of the common man, Wallace finds Russia today to be far superior in 4, all but, quote, Bill of Rights democracy. Let us not imagine that this is a Russian defect in Wallace's view. Wallace says, some in the United States, and the context makes clear that Wallace numbers himself among them, believe that we have overemphasized what might be called political or Bill of Rights democracy. Carried to its extreme form, it leads to rugged individualism, exploitation, impractical emphasis on states' rights, and even to anarchy. Now, in the following section, Burnham goes on to describe how another aspect of Bonapartist politics in the United States occurred when Roosevelt asked Congress to pass new anti-inflation legislation. And Roosevelt essentially said that if Congress did not do it, he would simply use his executive authority, especially in the context of the war, to do it anyway. So Wallace is sort of signaling here that this is another aspect of political Bonapartism in the United States, that the executive power is essentially now using the legislative power as a rubber stamp. Burnham goes on to say, when we keep in mind the connection between Bonapartism and the formula of democracy as government by the people, we should not be surprised by what might otherwise seem to be a paradoxical political phenomena. The rapidly growing number of individuals in this country who may be properly called democratic totalitarians. In the name of their democracy, they preach the attitudes of Bonapartism, and they advocate the suppression of the specific institutions and the specific rights and freedoms that still protect the individual from the advance of the unbridled state. Huey Long knew much more about politics than these persons ever will know, when he said that if fascism destroys democracy in this country, it will do so in the name of democracy. He was correctly predicting the role that the democratic totalitarians are today playing. His opinion, expanded into the language we have been using, may be put as follows. The Bonapartist development of the democratic formula of self-government will be used in the attempt to destroy those concrete individual and social rights which were once also associated with the idea of democracy. And Burnham concludes this section, or my excerpt of it, as follows. It should not be imagined that this phenomena is confined to the United States. Some people have the naive opinion that another country's despotism was established in the name of despotism, that dictators who were in the process of destroying freedom made clear to the people that they were doing just that. Naturally, it never happens that way. The modern despotisms have all marched to the tune of the workers, or the people. So there's a lot here that we could potentially discuss in the Q&A. I think that, I suspect that many of you may share with me a certain feeling that some of what Burnham is writing here resonates today with some of the political controversies of our own time. I would also add, and I didn't really flesh this out for this presentation, but I think it's very indicative that that what Burnham is critiquing here is the form of the Democratic Party as sort of the movement of movements, right? The Democratic Party as this sort of political mediator of sort of group-specific claims of greater integration into the middle managerial and upper elite ranks, right? And in that sense, I think it's significant that that Henry Wallace was actually something of a political hero to George McGovern, who redesigned the Democratic Party's nominating conventions reforms between 1968 and 1972 that essentially established the Democratic Party as we know it today. And so I think if one is trying to trace the contemporary Democratic Party's Bonapartist impulses along these democratic lines, I think one can profitably sort of look back to the McGovernite moment, which in turn was looking back to this Henry Wallace moment. And I think Burnham helps to clarify some of what's at issue there. Now, it's also interesting because Burnham's conservative liberalism, again, sort of cuts a double figure in the sense that he is trying to safeguard, in one sense, you could say, and it's clear from this passage, he's not so much opposed to aristocracy that he supports the Bonapartist democratic trampling of political rights and liberties in favor of greater democratic upward integration and circulation of the elites, right? And some would say that those are some of the politics and social dynamics that are characterizing our own era. So he's certainly a critic of democratic Bonapartist overreach. And at the same time, much of the rest of his book is aimed at what he sees as an even greater problem in fascist Nazi Germany and in the Soviet Union, wherein a sort of democratic Bonapartist politics has taken hold and is now essentially constituting a new elite that has that has abolished rights and liberties. So he does think that rights and liberties matter, and essentially the tendency of the democratic Bonapartists is to sort of establish themselves as an elite and then, as it were, kick the ladder down so that others cannot use those same rights and liberties to organize oppositions openly and allow for the continued circulation of the elites. So having said all of that, what are the horizons of this politics, right? What are the limits of it? Initially, it was quite exciting to me, like I say, to read this kind of bracing critique of certain democratic totalitarian impulses. But I think it's important to keep in mind that there is a deep conservatism here, right? Because essentially Burnham is advising the elite, or trying to advise the elite and the middle managerial ranks on a kind of moderate course to continue the ever same, right? That will essentially keep this sort of managerial society, I think we would say sort of capitalist, an evolution of capitalism into a kind of managerial condition, as Wyatt was pointing out, but to do so in ways that simply result in a smoother functioning of that system. So in closing, I want to talk just a little bit about Burnham's departure from the Marxism of the Second International. In Burnham's hands, revolutionary social democracy's political goal of organizing capitalist society so as to socialize and consciously redirect the means of production at a global scale slips into the netherworld of utopian fantasy. Indeed, Burnham completely sidesteps the Marxian conception of social revolution beyond capitalism into communism, when he redefines the concept of social revolution to mean always and everywhere and forever, nothing more than, quote, a comparatively rapid shift in the composition and structure of the elite and in the mode of its relation to the non-elite. Of the many points of entry for a Marxist critique of Burnham, I believe this point may be the single most fundamental. In closing, I will quote selectively from the 2 closing paragraphs of Paul Maddox's 1943 review of Burnham's book, The Machiavellians, to draw out this point. And I'm going to paste this here in the chat, just so you all can see what I'm reading from. So Maddox writes, if the evidence of the past shows anything, it shows that man has changed many things, his surroundings, his life conditions, and himself. Until now, he has left undisturbed the class division of society. To do away with this relationship presupposes the removal of many obstacles in the way of a rational society. The powerless in society are more than ever conscious of their weakness. They bend their heads still lower. The frightened intellectuals rush forward to swear new allegiance to the dominant powers. In order to maintain some sort of self-respect, they do not hesitate to represent their fear as scientific insight. Yet all the while, the contradiction between class rule and social needs is growing. The means of production are still in the hands of the ruling class, but to keep them there, the means of destruction are now placed in the hands of the masses. With such means at their disposal, they can now have objectives. They can become logical and scientific. In times of great social crisis, ideologies wear away quickly. New ones can hardly be developed fast enough to take full possession of men's minds and to cover up and make bearable the reality of present-day existence, which has as its ends death and destruction. It is quite possible that favorable circumstances or the force of circumstance may allow or force the masses to act in accordance with their own interests. If they do, they can abolish classes, for history is made not by some men, but by all men. If some men try once more to reduce for their own narrow purposes the coming mass movements directed against existing powers, they may once again succeed. Yet they cannot succeed in terminating the social crisis, which has as its basis, finally, in nothing but the neglected need for abolishing class relations in order that the existing productivity may be utilized for the welfare of all. Whatever happens, there is no single valid reason for assuming the classes cannot be abolished. Instead, there are many valid reasons for believing that the abolition of class relations will solve the present's most urgent problems. So that is what I have to present. Put a lot out there. And I think with that, we can open it up to Q&A.
Yeah, you have to make it for panelists and attendees, Ed, when you post. Ellie did it though for you. It's all good.
Okay. If people have questions or comments in the chat, that's fine, but it would be good if people could.
Yeah, raise your, I mean, obviously we can't force you to ask questions, but this whole presentation is really designed to be worked through, just as much as it is designed for anything else. And so we sort of would like questions. I think that's about right, Ed. Would you sort of agree with that?
Yeah, I'm going to try to allow everyone.
Yeah.
I haven't done this before, but I'm just trying to allow everyone to talk here. So now it's just going to turn into like a really big meeting with everyone talking.
Yeah, I mean, we can't stay too long. Ed and I have to go to our CIA handler. But until then, we can keep going. So, yeah, questions.
Yeah, can you guys hear me?
Yeah.
Yeah, so I guess I just have one question, and it follows up a little bit, just to go in more detail on something about the way in which the left nowadays might, the way in which the left might be subservient to a type of Burnhamism. Because Ed, at the end of your presentation, you mentioned how there was this, that the conservative character of Burnham was that he, he gives this sociological picture, but ultimately he's kind of giving a recommendation, as it were, to the ruling elites, and that, this is really for kind of preserving something. Um, but why you also like suggested that the left gives into a certain type of Burnhamism, and it seems to me that, like, whether it's the DSA or whoever we're talking about, that they probably wouldn't accept the characterization you gave, Ed, that like the stuff that you were saying that Burnham is trying, this idea of trying to like give wise advice to the elites. I think most of the modern day left would certainly reject this. But obviously, I think you're also still onto something, that somehow they are, uh, that they do, they inherit something from him, maybe unconsciously. So I just want you to go into a little more detail of how the left maybe consciously or unconsciously inherits something from Burnham.
Well, others may have different ideas on this, but just to my mind, Burnham may be right that this is what, like absent. I think he's wrong about the possibility for socialism, both as a sort of end goal and also as a politics that could be organized, to reach that goal in and through capital society. That, I think, is Burnham's fundamental conservatism. But it's not obvious to me that he's wrong about what capitalist politics actually becomes in the absence of the left undertaking precisely the project I just referred to, right? Burnham may be right that in the absence of a mass socialist party, there is nothing more than this kind of, to use, I think, an appropriate Marxist category, nothing more than a kind of petit bourgeois democratic brokering of rising and falling groups, again, mediated through politics. And I don't think that anything that, for example, the DSA seeks to accomplish really transcends that horizon. I also, part of why I mentioned McGovern is that the founding moment of the Democratic Socialists of America is the McGovern campaign, is the George McGovern campaign of 1972 and its aftermath. That is the political occasion for, I should say, DSOC, which then becomes DSA. That is Michael Harrington's breakaway moment. And so, it's difficult, given the trajectory of both DSOC, DSA, and the Democratic Party, and of McGovernism, but the same could be said of pre-McGovernism. It's difficult to really see anything other than what than what Burnham is here describing.
It's sort of also, it's like it goes back to sort of what I said about how there are different variations of Burnhamism, and there's Burnham's Burnhamism, you might be able to say, which is what Ed described. But then there's also a way in which, you could argue, I think certain people on the left today would argue that, like, for instance, identity-based rights are the thing that needs to be preserved in order for there to be elite circulation. But fundamentally, they're all the same. They're all Burnhamism. They're all replications of Burnhamism because they're this lowering of horizons from socialism.
And to that, I would add, if you want to see the opposite, right, because it's not just an identity-based politics. You could look at Michael Lind's book, The New Class War, and in fact, it was through Lind that I think, through our member Gregor, who interviewed Lind and discussed Lind with us, that Wyatt and I really got on the trail of Burnhamism in the first place, because for Lind, the important thing is economic integration, right? So you need, Lind calls, I don't think either of us really focused on Lind for this presentation, but I'm familiar with him enough to say that he calls in his book and publicly for what he calls a democratic pluralism. And a key component of that is that rather than identity-based integration and representation in the middle managerial and elite ranks. He wants more of a class-based integration and representation in the middle managerial and elite ranks. But I think, you know, those are fundamentally the same sort of petit bourgeois political project, right? You're not talking about transforming, you're not talking about organizing and consciously controlling and redirecting the means of production, even at a national level. I mean, maybe you are, but you know, to the extent that you are even at a national level, it's again, it's like kind of on this like national managerial basis with a disorganized society that's being mediated by the Democratic Party and these kind of middle managerial ranks, right? Which is not the Debsian vision of sort of mass social organization, an independent political party that's oppositional, taking governing power, right? So that would be, I guess, you know, there are different versions of this Lindism. And in fact, you know, in that respect, I think that many progressives who pursue, you know, not whether it's a class-based or an identity-based politics, you know, could be said to engage in that same fundamental project. So I think what's refreshing about Burnham is the honest conservatism, right? Of that he actually comes out and says, utopia is impossible. We're giving that up. And what we're going for instead is a kind of smoother cycling up and down of groups within capitalism, essentially. I hope that answers your question.
Yes, that was helpful. Thank you.
Hi guys. Oh, sorry.
Go ahead. Yeah.
Yeah. Well, first of all, thanks for the talk. It was really good. And so I guess maybe picking up on that, I think an interesting question that was raised by Wyatt was, you know, to the extent to which Burnham is dialectical or not dialectical. I know that he explicitly rejects dialectics in an essay, but he still talks about modes of production and the sort of the transformation of one mode of production into another as a totality. But he does reject the dictatorship of the proletariat specifically. And I'm curious what your guys' thoughts are about this. I remember, you know, he sort of takes the experience of the USSR and says, this shows that you can have the dictatorship of the proletariat and you can have the abolition of private property and you don't get socialism. And he says that, but he goes a step further and says that this is because of the sort of imperialist managerial society that's highly technological and requires managers. So that you have the dictatorship of the proletariat, but then they basically have to collaborate and give power over to the managers in order to actually seize the means of production. It makes me think of when Max Weber says that the Spartacist Bund were dilettantes with machine guns. So anyway, I'm just curious. It seems like this is the vital sort of point of bifurcation between Burnham and Marxism for me. And I'm curious what you guys just make of this idea of his, that somehow imperialist managerial society makes the dictatorship of the proletariat impossible.
Yeah, I mean, what I think is important to sort of look at with Burnham is he sort of takes a meat cleaver to capitalism and this whatever society emerged from World War I. And so in that sense, he sort of severs its history completely so he can just describe it without necessarily contextualizing it and placing it back into the development of capitalism and capitalist regression, because he doesn't really have that concept. And so that's where it sort of becomes undialectical, right? And also obviously in the sense that it forever sort of cancels any horizon beyond whatever this is, right? Whatever is. Yeah, I mean, I think this is actually, it's important to note that this is actually sort of, in a way, almost all sort of left-wing sociology today. Not to pick on sociologists, but in a way, they also sort of replicate Burnhamism as well, right? Like, not in the sense that they're talking about the managerial state, but in the sense that oftentimes they're sort of taking a meat cleaver to history between what was 20 years ago and what is now, and just describing what is now. And the left often does this with neoliberalism, where neoliberalism, you know, to them, it's almost as if capitalism didn't exist before neoliberalism, is I think the way some have put it. And that's sort of a replication of this same sort of undialectical thinking.
Yeah,
does that help? Yeah.
Yeah, but I'm curious what you think about Burnham's specific argument for why the dictatorship of the proletariat has to fail now that the managerial revolution has happened.
Well, okay, so there's actually a point. So there is another separation that needs to be made here between Burnham in 1941, when he's writing the Managerial Revolution, where he says some things along those lines, but actually at the end, he sort of says that socialism is still possible. And in many ways, in 1941, he's still trying to think. I'm not going to say he's trying to think like a Marxist, because he's clearly not doing it very well, but there is at least still this sort of, it's actually more pessimistic than the Machiavellians in a certain sense, because he's only simply describing these things and then saying they're bad. But then at the very end, he says that, like, you know, if everyone really wanted socialism, he doesn't say socialism. I think he uses the term peace, plenty, and freedom, or something like that. Then we could have peace, plenty, and freedom. But that's not what's going to happen. But so he actually hasn't totally foreclosed on any possibility, but it's so removed from sort of a socialist context that, but Ed might be able to answer the question a little bit better, because at the point where Burnham's writing in the Machiavellians, he's very much wholly abandoned any notion of sort of Marxism or socialism or anything like that.
That's right. And I think the short answer, I guess I would redirect the question a little bit, in the sense that if we take the outcome of the revolution in Russia to have depended centrally on the outcome of the revolution in Germany, in other words, if we think about the failure of the world revolution, then I think what comes into greater focus is the German problem, as I sort of, you know, described it in short. And so then the question is, how does Burnham understand that? And I think the short answer is it's through the theory of the iron law of oligarchy, articulated by Robert Michels. I think it would be worthwhile to consider in depth the differences between the accounts of Lenin and Luxemburg on the one hand, of the leadership of the Social Democratic Party in Germany, and Michels's account on the other. What I understand is that Michels essentially articulates a kind of deterministic account, in which when any kind of opposition, even avowedly democratic or revolutionary, reaches a certain size, that it, by the nature of the organization, the leaders become divorced from the led and pursue interests, you know, sort of bureaucratic managerial interests of their own, strike compromises with the status quo of their own, right? Now, I think that the way that a Lenin and a Luxemburg would respond to this is that this precisely shows the importance of leadership, right? That this is indeed a potential, but it's not determinative. And I think, you know, if we think even about our own organization, Platypus 1917, you know, what is the significance of 1917? It's certainly not, you know, the great accomplishments of the Soviet state, right? But I think what that date signifies is the potential of a self-conscious political leadership to try to address precisely the tendency that Michels takes as a sort of deterministic tendency, but Lenin recognized as a challenge to be overcome through education, through organization, through the theoretical struggle against revisionism within the Second International, right?
And also
the key.
The context of sort of the death at birth, the stillbirth of Trotskyism, right? I think is also sort of crucial to sort of bring up here. Like Burnham is writing at a point where like it's quite clear the Trotskyist movement has failed. I mean, there's about to be a war, basically. I mean, in his sort of direct, hardline vision of what's going on, it's really just a war between three fascist powers. I mean, and so that's sort of the world in which he's writing. And so you sort of have to look at that as well to sort of see where the horizons get canceled, I guess.
To that, I would just add that, you know, Burnham does think that the US is importantly different in the sense that he sees in FDR and especially in Henry Wallace, again, that same kind of Bonapartist democratic tendency towards fascism, precisely, right, insofar as Wallace says, actually the important thing is, you know, educational democracy, is economic democracy, democracy of the sexes, ethnic democracy, right? This kind of movement of movements. Again, you almost have like proto-McGovernism right there in 1942, Henry Wallace, who runs for president later in 1948. And actually Bill of Rights democracy, that's not so important, right? Like actually we could dispense with that. They don't have it in the Soviet Union, but that's not so important. That's the one we could dispense with. You know, Wallace sees that as the sort of, if you will, like proto-fascistic or more properly totalitarian tendency in American politics. Burnham sees that, but he does think, at least as of 1943 in the Machiavellians, that there's a meaningful difference between, you know, societies, polities, where this, you know, these democratic, these political rights and liberties exist and where they don't. But again, you know, ultimately the basis of that assessment is not the basis on which the Second International supported bourgeois political rights and liberties, which was not only as a means of opposition, but also as an inheritance of the bourgeois revolution, and part of the, you know, indeed part of the final goal of a socialist society as well. But rather, you know, the context, the kind of grounds, the ideological grounds on which Burnham is making that distinction is, again, to kind of facilitate this continual recycling and renewal of the middle managerial and elite ranks, including insofar as they organize into open political opposition parties and movements.
Thanks, guys.
Hey, can I jump in?
Yeah, Spencer, go ahead.
I mean, let me just ask you to be a little clearer, because I don't think it's fair to say that Trotskyism failed in 1940 exactly. I mean, I don't think that, you know, it's up to the left exactly to stop World War II or something like that, right? It's a question of what opportunities, you know, I certainly don't think that Trotsky himself thought that, you know, that Trotskyism would be able to stop the coming war. And so why isn't Burnham just a renegade, right? Why is Cannon's critique, Shachtman's critique, you know, why isn't it adequate? Like, you know, in other words, like at some level, right, if we're talking about the left, we would say there's more to learn from Trotskyism than from this right-wing split. So I guess what I'm asking you is to specify exactly, like, and I'm not denying it, but to specify what you think there is to learn from the engagement with Burnham. So perhaps say a bit about, you know, that moment, right, and what Trotskyism faced in 1940, and yeah, like I guess I also would like you to, you know, to put a finer point on, like, I mean, I think there's a polemical gesture that you're making when you say that the contemporary left is Burnhamite, right? And to clarify,
At best.
right? You know, so I guess I wouldn't say, you know, exactly that 1940 is like ground zero, right? I mean, there's obviously a certain crisis in 1940. So what does it mean to view the present in terms of the politics of 1940, and, you know, through this, you know, right wing or renegade split from Trotskyist lens?
I think there's a couple things. I think, for one, part of what I think differentiates him from both Cannon and Shachtman is this strong idea, especially in the Managerial Revolution, that all three systems of these three countries are converging towards a similar end. Now, and I think that's sort of it. It's worthwhile to try to understand why he thinks that, insofar as it allows us to actually mount a critique of whatever it is that he's observing. Whether or not it's real is, you know, should be the first thing, but it also just like, you know, if it is real, then where does it come from? How does it emerge from capitalism? And how does socialism solve it? And then as to Trotskyism itself, I'm not quite sure.
Let me ask you something, Wyatt. I mean, wouldn't Trotskyism just say there aren't three systems?
Yeah. I mean, so
right? That there's global capitalism, and that the Soviet Union at some level is a part of that, right? That the argument about the Russia question or about fascism is about strategy. It's not about
social. I think the important thing there is the fact that he's historically separating capitalism from this, and then saying that whatever we had before, at this point in time, we have something new that's not capitalism, that's all three countries are moving towards. And so I think that's sort of like, that is the split, really. I mean, I'm less sure how to answer about Trotskyism, because you're sort of right in that it is very hard to sort of put a year on it, but Trotskyism also wasn't successful. I mean, the SWP, I guess, still exists today, but it didn't. You know, we don't have global socialism.
I guess the way I would put a finer point on what you immediately just said there, Wyatt, is that I think that Trotskyism specifically was unsuccessful in bequeathing to subsequent generations the organizational or ideological foundation on which a mass opposition party for socialism could be built in this country. Now, that isn't to say that Trotskyism historically, to my knowledge, did not play a crucial role in that. For example, you know, much of the New Left only learned of the legacy of, you know, for example, Eugene Debs, or, you know, the existence of a revolutionary social democratic tendency in the United States through the Cannonite SWP, which republished, you know, the works of Debs. But I think ultimately, you know, I guess I'm drawing here on some of my previous study of both the history and the historiography of the Socialist Party of America. I think in the United States, Trotskyism ultimately shared with Stalinism in the last instance a rejection of the Kautskian party model on the grounds that, you know, for example, a figure like Victor Berger or Morris Hillquit ought not to have been in any socialist party in the United States worth its name. And I think that this bequeathed ultimately a sectarian organizational model that obviously has proven incapable of forming the basis on which a mass opposition party could be built in this country. So that doesn't necessarily address the particular juncture of 1940, except to say that's more specifically what I would look at in terms of accounting for the failure of Trotskyism, which, obviously, the limitations were severe, and one cannot say, oh, they didn't make the revolution, but I think one could expect a sort of transmission, an organizational and ideological transmission to subsequent generations of a preparation to take on party political tasks in a way that would go beyond the constraints of sectarianism. And I don't think anyone else has done that either. And so Trotskyism is remarkable, obviously, for being, alongside the Frankfurt School, among the most critical perspectives on this entire history. But I do think that has to be acknowledged, that limitation. And in terms of Burnham's own thought, I'm not familiar enough with exactly the grounds on which Burnham broke with Trotsky and Trotskyism, except to say I think it had to do fundamentally with Burnham's unwillingness to call for the defense, the revolutionary defense, the military defense of the Soviet Union in war.
Yeah,
And
that's exactly what it was. I mean, yeah, it was this question of the defense, and that's also where Shachtman breaks as well. But
right.
Burnham takes it in a right-wing direction, right? Like this is
and maybe
questions.
Yes.
Yeah.
And maybe, Spencer, we could reprise, because I'm forgetting all the points you mentioned, but the three of us had discussed this a little bit. And one point I mentioned as relevant, just in Trotsky's defense, in the context of a war, right? If you're trying to potentially politicize an opposition within a country, it becomes fatal to say that you don't call for that country's political defense in war. Now, of course, this raises questions of the example of the First World War and so on. But I think, at least at the tactical level, it's understandable why Trotsky, who wanted to gain adherence in the Soviet Union, would take that line at a time when Trotskyists and plenty of non-Trotskyists were being tried and executed and tortured and imprisoned, by Stalin on the grounds that they were wreckers and, did not support the national war effort. So I think it's more understandable that Trotsky would take that perspective, whereas Burnham, I think, comes off in some of this history as having, having sought clean hands or a clean conscience, not wanting to apologize for the Soviet Union, which again is understandable, but perhaps sub-political compared to Trotsky's perspective. But Spencer, I want to hear more what you have to say on this.
Well, maybe Cam spoke up in the
maybe
chat.
Cam,
I would just say, obviously Harrington's going to trace his trajectory through Shachtman, right? Not through Burnham. Burnham is obviously a right-wing figure after the split, and there's a polemic that I'm trying to get you to specify, to saying that these Harringtonians, these modern day Harringtonians, are actually Burnhamites, right?
It doesn't have to be like a direct sort of dissent though, right? So like in the same sense that we can say that, or at least we did say, I mean, people could say that this is wrong, that basically DSAism and Harringtonism comes off the back of the McGovern campaign. There's also a history here with Burnham that can't necessarily just easily be avoided. We can't simply, and it's not as though the critique that's being leveled necessarily by much of the left doesn't at least share these sort of commonalities, at least in terms of the way it's thinking about things.
Right, but when we look at the history of the left and its splits, right, there would be former Shachtmanites who would have an account of the right-wing character of Harrington's trajectory, right, because of a series of organizational splits and decisions that he took, and we would be able to trace history in a certain way through those sectarian debates, right, in a way that, the right is incoherent.
I guess part of it might be the fact that Harrington, today's DSA is not necessarily Harringtonian. And and likewise with the millennial left. And I don't necessarily know if the millennial left even really has any connection to this heritage of these splits and so on. So like, if we're talking about the left of today, I think there might be less of a point to be made there. Whereas I think you might be right if like I was to level the accusation that Harrington is a Burnhamite, which I would still probably defend, but I'm not sure it would be as defensible as saying that the people on whatever like left-wing meme pages on Twitter or something they're not really ideological descendants of any split on the left, except for Stalinism as just a whole.
Yeah, I guess the way I would put it is that the contemporary left is Burnhamite, not in the conscious sense, certainly, but in the sense that it takes for granted the sort of narrowed and limited horizons for politics, which Burnham articulates, without necessarily themselves articulating that those are their horizons. But
and when did that happen? When did they accept those narrow horizons? Is that the millennial left for you? Is that the new DSA?
Well, I would say that's I think the significance of Burnham's critique of Wallace. Actually, is that Wallace really lays out this sort of democratic, right? This platform for the Democratic Party as democratically integrating upwardly mobile aspirants into a sort of middle managerial and potentially elite rank. And McGovernism takes this up in a later period in an essentially similar way. And so I think that really it runs at least through the 1930s on the Democratic Party and on the left. Of course, I mean, for those who aren't familiar, the Communist Party was deeply involved in organizing, as the Burnham passage that I read makes clear, the Communist Party was deeply involved in taking up precisely these functions of, ethnic democracy, democracy of the sexes, economic democracy, right? That's practically a platform for the Communist Party USA's organizing and program in the 1930s.
This unconscious Burnhamism, though, also goes even further, I'd say, in today's left, in the sense that I would actually say that it's completely, much of it is very disconnected from these sort of historical leftist splits and so on, in the sense that actually a lot of it is very much just literally about inter-elite circulation. Like, to the extent that, a huge part of, let's say, Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez's support platform, you can just go sort of through the list, are all really either about putting more people of poor backgrounds or Black backgrounds or Latino Black backgrounds, you kind of go through the list, into power, as well as putting more people with college degrees being able to circulate into sort of the highest corners of society. I mean, because basically the current left and ever since the new left, but really especially today, I don't honestly know many leftists without a bachelor's degree. Most even have more than that. And so really a lot of left-wing politicians, I mean, insofar as you can call them left-wing, or the people at least that these people look up to, make a lot of their whole pitch is actually very much about making sure that these people can matriculate into the upper reaches of society.
Right. So and this is the last thing I'll say, and I'll turn it over to the rest. And I'm sorry, but for taking so much time. But what I'm asking you is your teach-in about the break in continuity on the left? In other words, very arguably, the critique of Shachtman and/or Cannon the critique of all of the opponents of Harrington's trajectory, which by the time I became a leftist, people thought, this is right wing on the left, right? Were adequate, right? If you wanted to know the critique of Michael Harrington, you would go back and read all of the polemics of the left with him, right? And whether you thought it was because he went in a certain, he didn't join with the Spartacists, or whether you thought Shachtman was wrong from the beginning and the true line of Trotskyism goes through canon, or whatever you thought, you would trace it that way, right? But it seems to me that you're arguing something else, right? That you are arguing that you can't understand the DSA today simply as the playing out of the trajectory of the past, but there's rather a way that even Michael Harrington's own self-understanding, which is that this is an evolution out of Shachtman, isn't true, but it's rather looks something more like the right-wing politics of James Burnham. And the question is how and when that transmogrification takes place. Right? That's what I'm trying to get you to think about, right? If you're saying this isn't like, because you could just say, well, this is just playing out of the right-wing character of Shachtman, right? It's just playing out of the consequences of all of the choices that Harrington and Shachtman made, right? Which was a road to, making peace with capitalism. But the question is, because I think David Faye's just said, look, Jacobin understands itself as coming out of the DSA. Of course they do, right? That's just their self-understanding. Are you saying that their self-understanding itself is false? Because I think that's a stronger claim, right?
Yeah.
And flesh that out. And
I don't know. I'm not going to speak for Ed on this, but I actually would argue that, and I would say that it's the failure to understand post-Fordism that sort of leads us to this position, because it made whatever sort of left came out of post-Fordism really literally just became an instant replication of both sort of the Wallace politics Ed's talking about and the politics of Burnham's sort of original critique of Fordism. And yeah, I mean, that's what I would push for as sort of the answer.
Yeah, I think, again, just what most clearly comes to my mind is Wallace and the Popular Front. And it's my understanding that Harrington himself, despite being an anti-Stalinist around the founding of DSOC, and perhaps even before, but I think certainly by the founding of DSOC, considered himself, and others of our members, maybe David or others, might actually know more about this reference, but considered himself consciously to be repeating the political strategy of the Popular Front on some level. And so that is the repetition I see. And I think what Burnham articulates is a kind of, functional sociological account of how that reproduces capitalism. Even though Burnham doesn't say this reproduces capitalism, he thinks that it reproduces, the ever same cycle of ruling elites and non-ruling non-elites in society and politics throughout history. That part, that bit of transhistoricism is not perhaps Burnham at his most insightful, but I think Burnham at his most insightful and critical is a recognition that at least under conditions of, so-called managerial capitalism or state capitalism, however defined, this is in fact the politics of the Popular Front, and then in turn of its latter day adherents like Harrington, will essentially play this role while leaving key aspects of the status quo untouched, unchanged.
So I have maybe a comment on the first two questions, like a sort of partial response to them, and then also maybe two questions which are following up directly on Spencer's question / prodding. So I guess in response to what Dang and Sam were saying, so the first thing that came to mind was Adorno and Trotsky. And so Adorno's, when, Marcuse comes up with his sort of one-dimensional man thesis, there's talk of state capitalism among Pollock and also Horkheimer. Adorno, when he responds to the rest of their sort of hypothesization of this sort of state capitalism, he has to say, well, look, there's the USSR and the Nazi Germany. We still have to treat this as contradictory, right? Because this is politically necessary, because this was politically necessary, right, from the standpoint of any sort of emancipatory possibilities, even though in however diminished a form. And so then analogously with Trotsky, right, and the Trotsky Burnham canon, this was all discussed, him in response to Burnham's sort of the Managerial Revolution, also the sort of Shachtman bureaucratic collectivism sort of idea, which it says we're going to have a sort of dystopia of unimaginable proportions, not too unlike our Democratic Party overlords today, said even if this was true, right, which for one reason or another is maybe not, we as Marxists, we'd still have to go after the goal of the revolutionary politics of the working class in order to see what contradictions there are and what possibilities for freedom, for emancipation in the sort of in capitalism still exist, right? And that brings to mind Trotsky's The Revolution Betrayed, right? The sort of title, what is the USSR? But then the emphasis would be on where is it going, which is what someone like Burnham elides in a sort of descriptive analysis of this. And so I'm reminded of, say, Adorno saying, or actually, no, I'll just leave it there. That's, I guess, my comment on those first two questions. And I guess to follow up on what Spencer was asking, maybe this is somewhat tangential to what you were saying, but the breaking point for someone like Burnham, right, to, Hegel, to Marxism, to finally say that the world revolution of 1917 through 1919 that went off the rails, that definitively failed, and that Lenin necessarily led to Stalin, all of it centers around the Hitler-Stalin pact, right? And also the USSR invading other countries, right? So how can someone like Burnham jump from something like the Hitler-Stalin pact to Hegel being totally falsified, to Marx being totally falsified, to the world revolution precipitated by the Second International going off the rails? That's the first question. I guess there's probably other questions, so maybe I'll just leave that as my only question.
It brings to mind something that Chris has said, that to organize the forces for revolution is simultaneously to organize the forces for counter-revolution. And in ways that are somewhat obscure to me, I think that's actually what, I think that's somehow at stake in the question of Hegel. In this, and what that would mean in this period between, what Hegel would mean in this period between 1917 and 1940. I think there is a conception in Burnham that what you have in Nazism and in Stalinism is essentially the same phenomena, this kind of rise of the managerial bureaucracy, and it takes somewhat different forms, different ideologies, different inflections, but it's essentially a social revolution that happens to be playing out in two different countries, again, with sort of counterposed ideologies and militaries, but expressing a fundamentally similar democratic Bonapartist phenomena and development. And I think in that sense, he's grappling with the fact that, in and through the Second International and the mass socialist organizing that it undertook for decades, the way that it actually constituted a proletariat, it did indeed set up the potential for counter-revolution, and that potential came to pass. And that, Burnham is grappling with sort of theorizing what that looks like. But certainly, you know, if you organize, I guess the other thought that comes to mind is that we have to remember that social democracy was also democratic in this sense, and that's in precisely the sense Burnham articulates. It was not, it did not have as its goal a kind of, you know, managerial Bonapartism, but it did have as its goal a kind of, you know, you could say a critical or socialist Bonapartism that would work in and through democratic discontents, including those of rising ranks in society, to take governing power and to consciously control and reshape production. But in the course of doing that, it certainly raises the possibility, right, that if that fails, if that is if leadership at that level fails, if leadership of that project fails or is betrayed in some sense, or is organized, you know, towards some kind of like national counter-revolution, then you're going to have this, you know, Bonapartist democratic outcome that is not going to be in any way resembling proletarian socialism. And so that, I think that just calls into question the sort of Hegelian legacy that was Marxism.
I think part of it also, though, is that I don't necessarily know if he's even working in any sort of Hegelian framework. I think that part of Burnham, but if he was, I think Burnham would really fit more or less not as like a liquidator of Hegelianism, but as some odd attempt to restore like right Hegelianism. So some sort of like a proto-Fukuyamaist almost. Like the whole world's converging on a series of sort of institutions and structures, and this is what there will be. I mean, I don't really know how else to put it. I think that question would have to be answered by someone else, but I don't know if Burnham is necessarily best read as some sort of like destroyer of Hegel or something.
And this gets to something that we were chatting about a little bit, Wyatt, which is the way that, I mean, granted, you've read Managerial Revolution and I haven't, but I get the sense from the Machiavellians that the transformation that he is grappling with, you know, between 1900 and 1940, you know, these, what he sees as these 40 years of a social revolution, on par in significance and implications with the bourgeois capitalist revolution of centuries before. There is a sense that this is under-theorized. You know, he's sort of bringing in all these different factors, and ultimately he seems to put a lot of emphasis on a kind of failure of the elites. You know, certainly if you read, certainly from reading the Managerial Revolution, you get the sense that above all, what you have is, you know, partial elite success and partial elite failure. In fact, he places a lot of blame on the sort of liberal capitalist countries for, you know, failing to sort of adjudicate the aftermath of the First World War in a way that would prevent the rise of Nazism, for example. And so that's really, you know, if you ask how does he really understand what is sort of deeply causing that transformation, I do think it remains at this level of a almost voluntaristic elite theory.
Yeah. I mean, there's more we could say on it, but I think we should move to the next question. Clay, should I answer your question live? Let me just read it.
Sorry, I was laying in bed because
Say it again if you want. I mean,
I can say it out loud for posterity.
yeah, just so I'm not like randomly. Unless, wait, does everyone see the question? I don't know exactly how this works. If everyone sees the question, then it's fine. Then I'll just answer. But I don't know how this.
I just don't know if it's being recorded, so I don't know if you guys like want it set out.
Okay, Grant said. Okay, yeah. Okay, I'll answer this one. I think it's sort of overstated the degree to which Trotskyists eventually become neoconservatives, but I also think it's overstated the degree to which neoconservatives are conservative. And how I would sort of frame this is that many of the people who became neoconservatives were Trotskyists, less out of ideology. They were more like members of youth leagues and things like this. And while there were a few serious sort of Shachtmanites that did become neoconservatives, like Bayard Rustin, and then you obviously have the non-Shachtmanite Burnham. Like, I don't necessarily know if it's like a true sort of tendency or something like that to become, but I do think there is also a way in which neoconservatives are, in fact, as you sort of say, they're upholding bourgeois right, and more importantly, they're upholding it universally, which may just mean that the left has abandoned the question of universal bourgeois right more than it means anything relevant to neoconservatives.
Yeah, I think, you ask, what does it mean for us to view an avowedly conservative figure through the history of the left? And more importantly, what of the tendency within Platypus to replicate this tendency of a conservative turn in the absence of an emancipatory politics among the left? Well, to the second part of that question, I know this is somewhat subject to debate, but I really don't see this in Platypus, in the sense that, I think that we as an organization would only be conservative in the sense of conserving the memory of the revolutionary Second International and of the political project that was a mass oppositional political party for socialism organizing across society. We're conservative in the sense that we hold up that memory and try to think through its implications. But I don't really see, maybe you could say more, what you say is a tendency of a conservative turn in the absence of emancipatory politics among the left. But to get to the first part of the question, what does it mean to view an avowedly conservative figure through the history of the left? Again, as I tried to indicate, I think that Burnham, I guess the way I see this is that Burnham takes stock of what become the actual political horizons and limitations of the left precisely in the absence of organizing that sort of mass party, or even laying the groundwork for that mass party to be reorganized in the middle of the 20th century. And I'm not saying at all that I think that it's obvious how one would have gone about doing that also. But again, I think, Burnham articulates certain limitations within which, the politics of the left since his time has fallen.
I think this also gets to actually a core of Platypus's critique, which is that the left is actually, in fact, not the left. So what we call the left is actually, in fact, quite conservative. And it actually might be kind of refreshing to have someone who comes out of the left and consciously knows they're becoming a conservative, as opposed to just engaging with somebody who doesn't get that yet and hasn't quite figured that out.
Yes, 100%. And one should add a conservative liberal, right? Like ultimately a conservative.
I mean, yeah, exactly. I mean, ultimately he's trying to work through this crisis without a left that can work through it. And so that's a very difficult position to be in. But that's what we're doing too. I mean, except we're trying not to go to the right. We're trying not to become conservative. And the moment we do, we become obstacles, right, to any sort of left politics.
This is Cam. I have a few thoughts on this. I'll try to keep it somewhat short, but obviously this is kind of my wheelhouse. But I think the first thing, just to clarify when we're talking about Burnhamism, is that Burnham is a bit of a shapeshifter, so it's kind of hard to specify like a specific, like a fully worked out set of ideas that he has, because he definitely, in the span of a decade, shifts quite a bit. This is something not only his American opponents observed, but also people like George Orwell, who wrote a fairly famous article about his second thoughts on the Managerial Revolution.
I kept telling Ed to read that article.
Yeah, it was actually my introduction to James Burnham when I was much younger. So I think there is just also like a shift in Burnham's general viewpoint from the Managerial Revolution, which kind of presents itself as this objective just analysis of the way society is going. And he does say that the end is determined, but what really matters is the pace and the method by which we reach this sort of new form of social organization, and that might be the thing that's preferable about the United States compared to the violence of the European countries. But that, I think, is one thing to kind of consider, is that he is, he was interested in spreading his ideas to as many people as possible and finding an audience and making a living as a writer, which is why one of his Trotskyist opponents called him the Christian Dior of politics. He had a new look every season. I think it's interesting to kind of bring up Burnham today, in particular with reference to Michael Lind, but then also other people who are talking about a potential realignment in politics, because one of Michael Lind's observations that I think is influential beyond people who would actually, read his works, is the idea that politics now is inter-elite struggle, that the Democrats and Republicans are both elite parties that use, the plebes to accomplish their agendas, but they're just different factions of the American elite. And that, for me, like, that is why I thought this would be kind of an interesting subject to explore, because that seems to be Burnham's relevance. When PMC is such a common term now and has kind of been rediscovered, and a lot of things that used to be called new class theory have been rediscovered, that is something that I think speaks to why he would be relevant. Yeah, I'll leave it there, because I could probably just keep going on, but I'd be interested to hear what you guys think.
Yeah, we were talking just before the teach-in, actually. I think you're right. Two points to make on Burnham's shapeshifting. One, I didn't get into this. Obviously, I had enough to present as it was. But Wyatt and I actually started reading Burnham in the context of reading him as American Trotskyism's sort of assigned critic of FDR and the Popular Front and the New Deal. And just a very, very interesting minor point that we both picked up on is that in a pamphlet he wrote on the New Deal, and maybe I could try to look it up and put it in the chat. It's worth, I'm sorry, it was a pamphlet on the Popular Front. But there he basically argues that political rights and liberties have for revolutionary socialists only a kind of tactical or opportunist importance, right?
Instrumental value.
Instrumental value, right.
And then he brings it up again in Machiavellians. He also is arguing that democratic rights have only instrumental value.
But in the first case, it's for, like the Trotskyist party, and in the second case, it's for, the efficient circulation of elites. And one thing I considered doing in advance of this teach and I didn't get a chance to do was to try to find some writings and speeches of Debs on, freedom of speech, freedom of assembly, the First Amendment rights, because my understanding, certainly from reading Luxemburg, and I believe Lenin also in State and Revolution, if I recall correctly, my understanding is that the Second International radicals, didn't view these as sort of purely instrumental, as, okay, well, let's take advantage of these rights, in order to advocate for socialism. They did take advantage of the rights to advocate for socialism, but they also saw them as part of the bourgeois inheritance that socialism would protect and indeed expand, after the revolution, leaving aside questions of civil war, which, are in which the suspension of rights is, necessary in all politics. So that was just an interesting example of Burnham's shapeshifting, that, where we thought that both in his Trotskyist years and in his conservative years, he was sort of sub-Debsian in the way that he treated political rights and liberties. But another point I just want to make, and then Wyatt, you can jump in, but another point I just want to make on the shapeshifting is, I do think, I could be wrong, because I actually don't know the long arc of Burnham's career. I haven't really read him past 1943 in the Machiavellians, but I do think that part of what I laid out does supply the logic of his subsequent political trajectory, in the sense that this is one of his, I think, late 1940s or 1950s books, The Web of Subversion, about communists and Stalinists in the US government, right? And again, going from just the passages I quoted, if he views that as a politics that will seek sort of democratic Bonapartist integration, maybe immigration too, integration of socio-political upstarts, right, at the expense of political rights and liberties, then you absolutely need to sort of lock down the state and the polity to, prevent that. And then another of his books, I couldn't really bring myself to read it yet, but Suicide of the West, Wyatt was saying that he talks about this kind of degeneration, right, of the elites in Western societies. And again, this is coming right out of, some of that sociology that I laid out in terms of circulation of the elites. And so I do think there is probably, if you look at the long arc of his intellectual career, I do think there are probably some tracks laid in the Machiavellians that he stays on, and that end up kind of furnishing certain ideas in American conservatism.
Part of Orwell's critique of his shape-shifting, though, is less actually about like any sort of theoretical shape-shifting. It's about like his actual politics shape-shifting, in the sense that he like makes predictions that don't come true about one side winning the war or another side winning the war. So I'm less sure, though, that he actually does shapeshift. I think there's certain themes that can be picked up on throughout his career, and especially after Managerial Revolution, where what really comes out of it is the lowering of horizons, but it's the lowering of horizons from a sort of anti-Stalinist perspective, which makes it inherently conservative. In a way that, say, the lowering of horizons, the way a sort of Shachtmanite social democrat might not be as conservative, or might not appear as conservative, but actually is really sort of the same phenomenon.
I thought I would address the question here in the Q&A. Justin asks, given Trotsky's refusal to militarily defend the Soviet Union, and given the implications of that for Trotsky's project of trying to win opposition in the Soviet Union, is it the case that Burnham's critique of Bonapartism loses sight of the necessity of world proletarian revolution? And I would say, what I tried to focus on in my talk, I'm less certain, maybe Cam or others could address this. I'm less certain on the prospects for world proletarian revolution in the years around the Second World War. But I feel that we can speak more to the actual world proletarian revolution in the years surrounding the First World War. And so I was really trying to, so I agree with what you say. His critique of Bonapartism loses sight of the necessity of world proletarian revolution. As a historical, in terms of his historical assessment, however, he views the outcome of that. He barely discusses. In fact, I don't think he at all in the Machiavellians he discusses the notion of a world revolution following the First World War. Again, he just sees it as a process of Russian elites having been, sort of too decrepit, and therefore, succumbing to an organized counterpower. I do think, what you say raises a deeper question, which is, is it a kind of flat critique of Bonapartism? Is Burnham's a flat critique of Bonapartism that doesn't acknowledge, right? And I think this is actually important. This is what I was sort of alluding to earlier. Social democracy was social democracy, right? And so this process that Burnham is laying out of the mobilization of democratic discontents in society would also need to be taken up in and through a mass oppositional socialist party, and indeed it was when such a party existed. And so I do think there's a risk that in a kind of one-sided opposition to Bonapartism, one could fail to acknowledge the way in which socialist politics would need to take a kind of Bonapartist turn at a certain point. So yeah, if that's, I'm not sure if that gets at your question, but I think that's a good question to ask when reading Burnham on Bonapartism.
All right, let's do Spencer's question, and if everyone's okay with it, is everyone okay with that being the last question or series of questions? I mean, if someone really wants to ask another question, you can. If you have something you think is really important, please do.
I think we're good with that.
Okay. Yeah, if you're good with that, then just yeah, Spencer, take it away.
I just forgot to lower my hand. But I can.
Oh, okay. Well, then, does anyone else want? I mean, if you have something, then sure.
Yeah, give everyone else another opportunity, and if not, I'll ask the last question.
Okay. Does anyone else want to ask a question? No pressure. Okay, David.
So this doesn't have to be the last question if it's not good enough to be the last question, but
It's okay.
Maybe it's more of a comment. I think that what I want to try and say is a follow-up to what Spencer was talking about with respect to how you guys might be saying that the Harringtonism that's inherited by the DSA and Jacobin falls below Harrington, and in a sense is better represented by Burnham. And I mentioned in my comment in the chat something to the effect that for Bhaskar Sankara, his explicit self-understanding back in 2011 and 2012, when he was trying to bring together the DSA and the ISO under the banner of Jacobin, was that he was trying to do something like Harrington, and also something like Ralph Miliband's vision of the Labor Party in the 60s and 70s. When Ralph Miliband was kind of pro-labor, because he's kind of flippant towards the Labor Party. And I think that kind of fudging of the difference between kind of a laborite liberal and the realignment strategy of Shachtman gets at something about how the imagination of the DSA falls below that mid-20th century Shachtmanism. So the other point I want to bring up with respect to this is how Burnham becomes more influenced by Robert Michels than by Marxism. And the historical element of Robert Michels' analysis of the iron law of oligarchy is that he thinks that the social democratic parties in Europe are becoming increasingly more like Tammany Hall and the Democrats. And the Democrats in Tammany Hall are becoming increasingly more like the social democratic parties in Europe. And, you know, he's a student of Weber. And so Weber has this historical horizon of rationalization, that things are getting too rational such that they're irrational. So it's kind of like, despite himself, he kind of has this like dialectical formulation that's not quite dialectical. And so like from a Marxist perspective, like you'd have the opposite assessment of the situation, that things aren't rational enough, right? That there's an irrational totality. Um, but you know, it's like a necessary misrecognition, this Weberian analysis. And you know, like the Marxist interpretation of the crisis of these social democratic parties that Michel's dealing with is, as you guys were kind of outlining, it's actually the consequence of the growth and success of Marxism and becoming a leading force in society. That it's like a necessary form of appearance of the problem of proletarianization, and it actually poses the possibility, necessity, and desirability of the revolution. You know, it's like only Marxism can adequately explain the vulgarization of Marxism, right? Like that kind of Second International revolutionary Marxist understanding of opportunism. And so, yeah, there's kind of like a departure, I guess, on Burnham's part from that. And he goes more for this convergence thing as you were outlining. But yeah, I guess like I'm kind of zooming out and saying there seems to be a similar deprecation at the level of historical horizons. You know, and I don't know, like following up on Spencer, I do wonder when you guys would place that lowering of horizons. Do you think that it happens? You know, because like when Harrington forms the DSA in the 80s, he calls it like a remnant of a remnant. It's only a remnant of the realignment strategy, and you know, like they were involved with the Rainbow Coalition and electing progressive Democrats, and the students of Harrington who helped form the DSA, who are still in the DSA. Like we had someone like this on a panel recently. I think that Clay hosted, called "What is the DSA?" Yeah, and he was like, I don't know what these kids are talking about. Like they just don't really get what the DSA is for yet. We're here to like support progressive Democrats and build bases for them. Like I don't know what these kids are on about. So like I don't know, like you know, like I don't know if Harrington had like this, you know, made a distinction between what the DSA was doing and the horizons that he once formerly had. That might be true, but the students obviously didn't pick that up. And certainly the students of those students in the millennial left haven't picked that up either, or they are confused about it. I also think that there's this kind of like nostalgia for the mid 20th century stuff in response to neoliberalism. And that was a big element of the formation of Jacobin DSA. And so like Burnham and this kind of like, yeah, like new class analysis, it seems to like appeal as a kind of like anti-neoliberalism. But yeah, so this is more of a comment. I want, like, go ahead, you guys can jump in.
Yeah, and I think it's also worthwhile to point out the way in which, like, I sort of brought this up in my thing, how actually neoliberalism isn't, it is post-Fordist, but it actually isn't, it's not a reversal of Fordism. So in that sense, a lot of these kids are going to be, if their horizons are already going to be lowered from socialism, even a lowered horizon of a bad form of socialism, like Stalinism or something, if it's already going to be lower even than that, and they're basically going to be critiquing, I don't know, the corporate state or something, or like the square white men. Like, I don't exactly know exactly what their sort of thing is, but it all is actually very much, now it's being applied to post-neoliberalism. Through the whole era of the millennial left, it was applied to neoliberalism, but in fact, it's really all just the same sort of critique of Fordism, but recycled in such a way as to sort of mask that. And that critique of Fordism is actually, because its horizons are so much even further lowered than even Stalinism, it is actually actively conservative in a way that I think Harrington himself was not actively conservative. Like, when Harrington went on to talk to Milton Friedman on Milton Friedman's PBS show, I don't know what it was called. He would go to like Asia and talk about free trade or something. But he went on.
To choose?
What?
Free to choose?
Free to choose, yeah. He went on, and this might actually be Michael Harrington's sort of finest moment, but I think it's something that I don't think a DSA kid would ever say. And he basically said that Milton Friedman was right on this question of like freedom, but wrong in the sense that there's no real way you can turn back the clock and go back to sort of genuine free markets or something like this, which I think is sort of like, to an extent, the sort of neoliberal ideologues, that is their sort of goal. But he then says that, it points out that this is all just an ideological justification for capitalism to continue, corporate capitalism to continue. And he's right on that. And he's right on that in a way that I don't think any DSA kids these days even could recognize. I don't know.
I've got a few responses, David. Thank you. I appreciated your comments. Just on the issue of the DSA being Burnhamite or sub-Burnhamite, I guess just one way to put a really fine point on this is that as we were preparing for this teach-in, as I was reading the Machiavellians, it's been the news and political cycle of the past month or two, right? And so I'm reading about, I posted an article to the Platypus list on Counterpunch to the effect that the Republican Party should be literally disallowed from organizing and from existing as a legitimate opposition political party because they're literally Nazis, right? You have all kinds of, now I suppose opposition party in the sense of Republican Party figures and, talking points literally banned and prohibited from Twitter, from Facebook. These months have not been kind to the First Amendment and to the Bill of Rights. Certainly even questions of, should people be allowed to peaceably protest, the process or the results of a democratic election.
And the demand to give the managerial firm more power over like freedom of speech, like democratic rights. Like that's, I mean, I don't know. Yeah.
No doubt.
Sorry to interrupt, but yeah, it's just so important.
Right. And so what I found very interesting, right, is, and meanwhile, many of our members were commenting correctly, where's Jacobin, right? Why isn't Jacobin saying anything about the threats to free speech, the threats to freedom of assembly, right? If our Bill of Rights are kind of specifically political rights and freedoms are coming under threat right now under the guise of anti-fascism or social justice, again, democracy, what that actually means is sort of democratic inclusiveness, democratic inclusion, integration of previously excluded or less privileged elements in the middle managerial and elite strata, right? Why isn't Jacobin on that? Why aren't they taking it up? And so what I found very bracing and very appealing about Burnham is that he's sort of making a full-throated argument for First Amendment and other rights, other specifically political rights. And so what I then had to sort of undertake a study of his, larger body of thought and his reading of this, this social science to figure out was the fundamentally conservative basis on which he is arguing apparently the same thing that a classical Debsian civil libertarian socialist would also argue. So I think that's the way that I found, the contemporary left to be most immediately sub-Burnhamite, is that, Burnham, for conservative reasons, was sort of taking up what I felt to be, what I think are political positions that are clearly identifiable with Second International radicalism and Marxism historically.
But isn't that why they're Burnhamite though? Because he only takes those up insofar as they're instrumental to his project. And I think the left today only takes up these issues insofar as they're instrumental to their project. They don't believe in like natural bourgeois right or something like that.
Yeah, that's right. Well, I think the left today, in short, follows much more from Burnham's objective critique, Henry Wallace, right, in saying that if we're talking about democratic inclusiveness, then as long as we're talking about ethnic democracy, democracy of the sexes, economic democracy, or educational democracy, then we can really dispense with specifically political democracy, right? That to Burnham is the democratic Bonapartist formula. And I think that describes much of the left today. So he is distinguishing his own view from that, right? That's his objective critique in the Machiavellians. David, you also said a very, very important point that Michel's is saying the SPD is becoming like Tammany Hall, because Burnham writes as if the problem of democratic Bonapartism, of course, like almost everything, he thinks it's transhistorical, right? It's existed always and everywhere. And no doubt there are, certain reference one could find in the classical era, I'm sure. But he really acts as if this begins with the New Deal. And so I think that's just another point to make, in terms of the limits of his approach to Bonapartism, is that he really sort of elides the period between effectively Napoleon III and FDR. It's as if there's not a history of political Bonapartism between those two touch points. And perhaps relatedly, Burnham in the Machiavellians, he follows a particular sociologist, and I'm forgetting if it's Mosca or Pareto. I was talking with Wyatt about this, about essentially seeing the Belle Epoque as an ideal, right? And almost if you had to ask, Burnham, what was sort of before the Managerial Revolution, the ideal society, it almost seems like Belle Epoque Austria-Hungary, right? Like Austria-Hungary, like 1885 or whatever. And the reason specifically is that there's this sort of motley of social relations. Some people are apparently getting by according to feudal or old aristocratic forms. There are new capitalists and bourgeoisie. There are different ethnicities. Sort of everyone has a little bit of a different basis of reproducing themselves in society. There's more of this sort of cosmopolitan sense. And for Burnham, he thinks that that's one of the few ways in which power can be checked. And so I, like you raised the issue of neoliberalism, and that actually made me think that that's almost a, if you will, like a neoliberal impulse in Burnham, right? Is to sort of like look back to the Belle Epoque, before this overcrowding managerialism, to a time when this more sort of motley, diversified set of social relations was actually historically possible.
That's clarifying, because something that was remarkable about what Wyatt teased out in summarizing Burnham's argument was that, like, Burnham said something to the effect that it's not until the New Deal that the bourgeoisie is no longer able to rule. And I was thinking, well, that's actually not what Marx was saying.
I didn't say that. I said all I was pointing out was that in Marx's 18th Brumaire, the bourgeoisie is able to rule still at that point, but it's not until the crisis in World War I that the bourgeoisie is unable to rule.
Right. So, I mean, I would say, like, Marx is pretty clear that he thinks that in 1848 to 1851, the bourgeoisie is no longer able to rule, and the proletariat's not yet ready. And this is the circumstance, this political power vacuum of failure to lead the democratic revolution is what leads to the state rising above civil society. to try and manage the crisis and that's what allows for Bonapartism. That's what creates the need for Bonapartism. And this is when Marx and Engels start describing Bonapartism as the ideology of the bourgeoisie, and talking about like America and its two-party system after the Civil War as kind of like the example par excellence of Bonapartism. And so it's interesting that, like as Ed was just saying, that in Burnham's imagination, there's like, but this period between like 1848 and 1919 is somehow like doesn't have this problem, or like Bonapartism is somehow less of a problem, or whereas like I think for Trotsky and Adorno and Horkheimer, for instance, they see it as a repetition, although there's a regression, and the regression is really in the consciousness of the problem, and specifically in the consciousness of the possibility it poses for socialism, like the dialectical inverse of Bonapartism being the necessity of the dictatorship of the proletariat. Like that's why it's a regression for them. It's not a regression because like there's new kinds of managers. You know what I mean?
But I don't think that's necessarily Burnham's argument. I don't think Burnham's argument is that it's a regression because there's new kinds of managers either. I think he's simply trying to expand off of Lenin's imperialism, and imperialism is different than what came before. I mean, it is a higher stage of the highest stage of capitalism, and the types of firms in imperialism have a different set of power at its core. And whereas I think like a Marxist would simply point out that this is the continuation of capitalism despite having these new elites, Burnham is simply trying to flatten that and just say there is no more capitalism. This is the new system. But I don't think that Burnham is making some sort of argument that like the regression here is like different elites or something, or different managers. Like I think he thinks that managers as like the primary unit of governing society is a new phenomenon, and he's partially right on that in the sense that the owner-operated firm is still central to most economies, including the United States, really up until World War I. And it's not until World War I where the state under Wilson gets truly heavily involved with both corporate and labor power. Like Woodrow Wilson invites the head of, I forget which union, to like sit in his cabinet. He invites the heads of major corporations to sit in his cabinet and try to work through how they're going to prosecute World War I. Like that happens. And that's very different from even what happened 20 years prior under prior administrations. Like there is a clear change of power even from traditional Bonapartism in this new era. And I think Lenin does bring this out. And I do think it's a continuation in some senses of Bonapartism, but it also is qualitatively different.
I just want to say, David, I very much appreciate your comment because, you know, really, I think you've really completed what I was had only partially pieced together in what I was saying about Burnham's approach to Bonapartism, in the sense that, you know, I was trying to show how it essentially is premised on, and, you know, you could say further contributes to the obscuring of the potential for organizing and controlling production socially and globally. But I think, you know, you're drawing on Marx to take it even further, which is to say not only that, but the Marxist conception was that Bonapartism was precisely the index of, negatively, the index of that possibility. And certainly that's nothing like Burnham's view. You know, he absolutely opposes Bonapartism, not in that dialectical sense, but rather flatly negatively, as simply something to be constantly guarded against and opposed.
Yeah, and if I can come back around to what Wyatt said and kind of link it with what you were just saying, Ed. Lenin, yeah, like imperialism was a subjective qualitative change in the subjectivity of bourgeois ideology. Like that's how Lenin's approaching it. And you can see it in Socialism and War as well. This idea that this kind of the imperialist war is actually like it's a reflection of the strength of the proletariat and the growth of the proletariat, and it's posing the possibility of the proletariat to actually lead the discontents that are otherwise being posed by imperialism. So there is this kind of like it's not like I would add that caveat that it's for Lenin, the subjective change isn't just happening because the bourgeoisie is becoming more powerful or something. Rather, it's an index, as Ed was saying, of the strength of the proletariat for Lenin.
Well, like the bourgeoisie is in many senses less powerful because there's less of them. I mean, they get sort of infused into these firms at this point. Like you no longer have sort of this widespread like owner operator class at this point, whereas you might have had that even 30 years prior, and even after Marx identifies a crisis emerging, and you don't have mass unemployment as big of a problem in 1848 compared to even just 20 years later.
But like the militarization of Europe and imperialist war, like that's a significant change. I guess, do you see what I'm saying though about the relationship?
Yeah. No, I see what you're saying. Yeah. Okay, I know, Cam, you want to say something, but it is getting a little late, and I have to figure out how I'm getting home on the train in this blizzard. So
I can give you a ride home. But does anyone else? Because I want to make sure we're rounding out our conversation here. Does anyone else have any questions or comments? We can do just a final last call and then wrap up.
this is the real last call. We're not doing another one after this, okay?
We've dwindled down to 10 attendees, so I think that's the hardcore is left. Well, if there's nothing else, thank you everyone for coming and for your good questions.
Yeah, thank you guys. And this is meant to be worked on more, workshopped on. I mean, you can still come and talk to us, and we're really happy to talk because we're still reading a lot of Burnham. So as Ed's pointed out, he's got how many books by Burnham do you now own?
I don't think I'm actually going to read The Web of Subversion.
Oh, I'm totally reading The Web of Subversion. I need something for my tinfoil hat hour.
Okay, well, thanks all. And thanks to, was it Ellie who organized?
Yeah, thank you, Ellie. And like we said, I mean, everyone here is in Platypus, so you could get this information anyways, but in case you don't have it, Thursdays and Sundays, be sure to check out the Northwestern Platypus chapter. Their coffee break is really great. That's what I can say.
Oh, interesting. Cam is adding that that Burnham testified against Shachtman.
Wow.
Very, very quickly, they had a hearing to clear Shachtman from some sort of blacklist, and the government's witness was James Burnham. And Burnham came in, he tipped his hat to Max, and just got a death stare in return. Yeah,
that's brutal.
The 20th century.
Now we know what Gregor's going to do to us, Ed.
Okay, well, good night all. Thanks again.
Good night, guys.